After January 6th, I thought a lot about, was this an isolated event, or did it reflect something much deeper that was wrong in the American political system? I concluded the latter. I saw a country where the institutions of the federal government had lost the faith of the people. All of the branches of the federal government have the lowest approval rating that we've ever seen in American history. We also are more deeply divided as a society than we've been at any time since the Civil War. I worry whether a country that's so deeply divided can survive as a democracy.
Good evening. I'm Kirk Hansen, and I'm your moderator for this evening. I'm a senior fellow at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, an emeritus faculty member at Stanford, and a member of the Silicon Valley Advisory Board for the Commonwealth Club. Tonight I'll be talking with Erwin Chemerinsky, the Dean of the Berkeley Law School. Now let me tell you a little bit more about Dean Chemerinsky. Prior to becoming Dean of the Berkeley Law School, he was founding dean at UC Irvine's School of Law, and he's also served as a law professor at Duke University, USC, and DePaul College of Law. He's the author of 19 books, including leading casebooks and treatises about constitutional law, criminal procedure, and federal jurisdiction. His latest book is No Democracy Lasts Forever: How the Constitution Threatens the United States. He's also the author of more than 200 articles, law review articles, and is a contributing writer for the opinion section of the Los Angeles Times, among other publications. He frequently argues appellate cases, including in the U.S. Supreme Court. Welcome, Dean Chemerinsky.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you.
It's a delight to be with you tonight. Just 1 year ago, you sat on this stage, interviewed by Commonwealth Club World Affairs CEO Gloria Duffy, and talked about your new book. She's a close friend of both of ours, and I hope to come up to the standards that she set. I also hope to come up to the standards that you've set, because you yourself have been in the interviewing role in many prior events for the Commonwealth Club. A year ago, you said that regardless of who wins the presidency in 2024, our democracy was in peril, regardless of who won the election. We're here to take stock of your views now that Donald Trump has been elected and has just completed his first 6 months in office. There's no subtlety here. The session is entitled The Playbook of a Dictator. Let's start by asking you to refresh for us your arguments in your book about the fundamental threat to American democracy from the Constitution itself and from the way we already function, regardless of who was elected this time.
Let me start by saying how delighted I am to be here. I really appreciate the Commonwealth Club inviting me and your interviewing me during this. No democracy lasts forever. Democracies are there and then they're not. We can all think of countries around the world that once were democracies and are no longer. After January 6th, I thought a lot about, was this an isolated event, or did it reflect something much deeper that was wrong in the American political system? I concluded the latter. I saw a country where the institutions of the federal government had lost the faith of the people. All of the branches of the federal government have the lowest approval rating that we've ever seen in American history. We also are more deeply divided as a society than we've been at any time since the Civil War. I worry whether a country that's so deeply divided can survive as a democracy. I finished the manuscript for No Democracy Lasts Forever in the summer of 2023. I chose the title in September of 2023. But to answer your question, what's gone on since January 20th makes me more worried about democracy in this country than I ever imagined that I would be. Since January 20th, President Trump has done more unconstitutional things in executive orders than we've never ever seen before from a president. And that's not hyperbole. And overall, the federal district courts have stopped what President Trump has been doing. There have been over 330 lawsuits filed against his actions. The Federal Court of Appeals, for the most part, have upheld those rulings, but mostly, almost entirely, the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of President Trump, which only heightens my fears with regard to American democracy.
Let's first take the basic policy stances of Donald Trump and his administration and just give him his due about whether there's anything specifically unconstitutional about what I have divined to be the core fundamentals. One, that immigration got out of control. Second, that public spending had grown too much. Third, that some advocates of diversity were going to cancel culture and to the extreme. There needed to be a reassessment of the balance of power generally in U.S. government, albeit towards more executive power versus other centers of power. Is there anything inherently undemocratic about those basic policy initiatives?
It's all about how they're carried out. Let's take the second that you mentioned with regard to funding. The Constitution says that Congress has the power of the purse. If anything is a quintessential legislative power, it's the ability to control federal expenditures. President Trump has cut federal funding in all sorts of ways that are just unconstitutional. The president has eliminated some federal agencies, the United States Agency for National Development, the Department of Education. But those are created by federal statute. Congress can pass a law limiting them, but the president can't do that. The president has cut funds to universities in clear violation of federal law. He's cut $2 billion to Harvard, $400 million to Columbia. And he says he's doing this because they're violating the federal law that says the recipients of federal funds can't be deliberately indifferent to anti-Semitism or other discrimination. But that law says that in order to cut off funds, there first has to be notice, a hearing, findings of fact. There has to be 30 days advance notice to the House and the Senate. The funds can be only cut off for the programs that are found to violate the law. President Trump followed none of this. President Trump has cut off funds for the National Institute of Health, the National Science Foundation, the EPA, and other agencies. I'm co-counsel in a lawsuit on behalf of the University of California faculty and researchers who have lost funds. At the time we filed our lawsuit a couple of months ago, according to DOJ websites, $330 million of federal funds have been cut off to University of California researchers. I now believe that's a dramatic underestimate. It doesn't include many grants we know of. It doesn't include subgrants. So it's probably between $500 million and $750 million of money cut off by the president. That's unconstitutional. It's also illegal. There's a federal statute, the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, that says that the president cannot refuse to spend money appropriated by Congress. I've taken one example where the president has taken onto himself a power that's never been vested in the executive. And it's very frightening to think that he gets to decide, not Congress, how federal money is spent.
Let's take some of the others and how he's gone about some of his other policy initiatives. What about immigration? What is, from your perspective, particularly troubling about the immigration enforcement?
Let's start with the image of masked ICE agents apprehending people off the street. These agents wearing no identification, these agents really being like the image we see from totalitarian countries. This is not for any law enforcement purpose. This is just to terrorize. 2 weeks ago today, a federal district court judge in Los Angeles found that ICE was stopping and apprehending people without reasonable suspicion that the Constitution requires, apprehending them without probable cause that the Constitution requires, and doing so just on the basis of race. And if you read the judge's order, it's chilling to see that people were being taken into custody just because they appeared to be Latino and where they were working. This included many United States citizens. This violates the Constitution, and the judge thankfully issued a preliminary injunction against it. President Trump called out the California National Guard. The law is very clear that the president can only call out the National Guard in very limited circumstances. As Federal District Court Judge Charles Breyer found, those circumstances weren't met here. President Trump called out the Marines. There's a federal statute, the Posse Comitatus Act, that says we're not supposed to use the military for domestic law enforcement. But that's what was going on in these circumstances. We can then talk about President Trump in this area invoking the Alien Enemy Act of 1798. This is a federal statute that says that if the United States is in a declared war or faces imminent invasion, it can summarily deport, quote, males over the age of 14 to the country they came from. Only 3 times in history has the federal government used the statute before this year: the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. President Trump invoked it to apprehend individuals who were allegedly members of a Venezuelan gang and take them to a maximum security prison in El Salvador. We know that many individuals were taken by mistake. Federal Court of Appeals Judge Patricia Millett said individuals were apprehended without a semblance of due process. In some instances, we know that the government lawyers admitted a mistake was made. Take the example of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a man who was apprehended in Maryland. The lawyer for the Justice Department said to the court that Abrego Garcia was apprehended by mistake. That lawyer for the Justice Department then got fired. Abrego Garcia was taken to a maximum security prison in El Salvador. He's now detailed how he was tortured once he got there. The Trump administration filed a brief in the Supreme Court that once he was taken to El Salvador, no federal court had jurisdiction to order it returned, and that no federal court could order the president to facilitate his return. That would give the President of the United States the ability to take anyone, including any of you or me, bring us to El Salvador and claim that no court would have jurisdiction. These are things we have never seen before in the United States.
There was even a mention, as I remember, that those prisons might be used for American citizens. Again, perhaps a mere intimidation rather than an action, but clearly.
Clearly unconstitutional and illegal, but President Trump said that he wanted to use it even for American citizens and said he had reached a deal with the president of El Salvador for them to build more maximum security prisons.
What about his interaction with the universities? Let's delve into that a little bit more. Clearly, there was public concern over anti-Semitism, and he has, in that name, taken a number of actions. Do you feel that's a genuine attempt to address anti-Semitism?
No, I think anti-Semitism here is being used as a pretext. Let's take Harvard University. President Trump initially cut off $2 billion in funding to Harvard. When Harvard didn't capitulate, he then said, adopting a policy that no researchers at Harvard, no faculty, could receive any federal money. When Harvard still didn't capitulate, he said, Harvard can't have any foreign students. 27% of the students at Harvard are international. It would be a devastating financial blow. All of this was about intimidating Harvard with the goal of, once Harvard would capitulate, then every university would have to capitulate. Thankfully, Harvard is fighting back and so far winning in the federal courts. And again, if this is about anti-Semitism, then there's a procedure. Under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, as I said, there has to be notice, a hearing, findings of fact, notice to the House and the Senate 30 days before cutoff of funds, an opportunity to ameliorate any violations, and the parts of the university that violate the law can have funds cut off. But this had nothing to do with this. This was taking away money from parts of the university like the medical school that had nothing to do with it. It was using anti-Semitism as a pretext to try to gain control of universities.
Let's look at today's example, Columbia, which did apparently make an agreement with the Trump administration yesterday. How do you regard that as a part of this process?
I was very sad to see Columbia capitulate, just as when the law firms caved to Trump. I was very sad about that. We all learned on the playground that when you give in to a bully, you make it only worse. I think if Columbia had litigated, it would have won. Instead, Columbia agreed to pay $200 million to the federal government, another $21 million to Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And according to the news stories, Columbia has also agreed to give the federal government oversight with regard to its admissions process, to change what it can consider in its admission process, to limit the number of international students it admits, and many other things. And the Trump administration said just today that this is meant to be their template for what they're going to do with other universities. Again, if we think about what dictators, totalitarian governments do in other countries, it's try to get universities to cave. Look at what happened to the universities in Hungary under Viktor Orban. And that's what I think is going on here.
Why is it important to Trump to take on universities, for example?
Think about who is there to challenge the Trump administration or to challenge any totalitarian government. One group is the lawyers, and we can talk about how he's gone after law firms and openly doing so for the sake of revenge. Another possibility is the press can check the president, and we can talk about how he's gone after the press and how some of the press is caved. But another source of checking and criticizing an administration is universities. And he's very much targeted them as well, as we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And the law firms? He's also targeted law firms. What's the rationale for that?
And this is disturbing. It started with a law firm, Perkins Coie, in Seattle, Washington. And you might ask, what was it that they did that caused them to deserve the sanctions that are described? And what the executive order says is they represented Hillary Clinton in 2016. It's not hiding that this is for the sake of retribution. And the executive order by President Trump said that no lawyers for Perkins Coie could continue to have security clearances. No lawyers for Perkins Coie could enter any federal building. That would include federal courthouses. And that no lawyers for Perkins Coie could continue to represent anybody who has a grant from the federal government, or the federal government would not continue to contract or give grants to anyone represented by Perkins Coie. This would put Perkins Coie out of business. Immediately, Perkins Coie went to court, and the judge issued a preliminary injunction in its favor, saying this is unprecedented. President Trump then went after other law firms. He went after the law firms of Jenner Block and Wilmer Hale. What did they do? Well, they hired lawyers who at one point worked for Robert Mueller, or in the case of Wilmer Hale, hired Robert Mueller, though he no longer works there. And the same sanctions would be imposed against them. They sued, and they also have gotten preliminary injunctions court. Then he went after the law firm of Sussman Godfrey. Why? Because they represented Dominion Voting and successfully sued Fox News in a case that settled for about $750 million. Again, the executive orders say this. The executive orders are clear that it's about retribution. All 4 law firms have won in court so far, but another 10 law firms caved and settled and have promised almost $1 billion of free legal services for President Trump's causes. I think what President Trump is trying to do, to go after the law firms, to say, if you challenge my policies, I'm going to try to put you out of business. This is unheard of in American history. It's never happened before.
The White House is also engaged in heavy criticism of judges during this 6-month period. How do you read that as a part of this strategy of the dictator, as you have given it for the topic?
Again, think about who can check this or any president. Obviously, the courts are key in this regard. I really believe that if our democracy is going to survive, it's going to be because of judges in the courts. It's not going to be President Trump voluntarily complying with the Constitution. It's not going to be the people around him like Pete Hegseth and Pam Bondi telling him he can't violate the Constitution. Congress is certainly not indicating any check on the president. So it's going to have to be the courts. And the Trump administration has very much targeted the courts. As soon as the first judge issued a temporary restraining order against the Trump action, with regard to the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, Elon Musk, who was then part of the administration, said that the judge should be impeached. And he put vile things on social media about going after the judge. To this point, impeachment resolutions have been introduced in the House against 7 federal judges who ruled against the Trump administration. A judge can be impeached only for treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. There's no basis for this. It's just about intimidating judges. Additionally, the rhetoric criticizing judges has been extreme and unheard of from a president. I mentioned to you the case 2 weeks ago where the federal judge issued a preliminary injunction against ICE stopping the racial profiling, the apprehending people without reasonable suspicion or probable cause. As soon as the decision came down, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, said about the judge, and I'm quoting verbatim, "He's an idiot." Well, to start with, the judge was a woman. But also, this is just about trying to intimidate judges. The Trump administration arrested a state court judge in Wisconsin. The Trump administration has tried to disqualify all 6 federal judges in Maryland who have been ruling against the Trump administration. But it's also, I think, helped to foment real threats of violence against judges. Last week, a federal court of appeals judge from D.C., Michelle Childs, says there have been 7 instances in which pizzas that were not ordered were sent to her home. This is the critics trying to convey to her the message, we know where you live and we can come after you. So all of this is very frightening to me because I say, if there's going to be guardrails of democracy upheld, it's going to be judges and courts.
Do you think this was planned from the beginning? Do you think these efforts to intimidate universities and judges and law firms and such is a pre-hatched plan of moving towards a dictatorship to weaken democracy? Or is that reading too much into Trump's capabilities?
And I want to be careful about language here, and I'll answer your question directly. I think a great deal of what the Trump administration did starting on January 20th was pre-planned. If you look at the Heritage Foundation Project 2025, it was very much the playbook of what the Trump administration did from its first days in office. Tremendous difference from the first Trump administration to the second in the content of policies, but also the speed with which they were executed. Likewise, when you see some of the things that were done, going after law firms, that began so early in the Trump administration, I think it had to have been planned. Going after universities, again, it was done so quickly, I think that it had to be planned. I don't believe that Donald Trump is setting out consciously to be a dictator. I believe he truly is convinced himself of the words that he said, and I'm quoting him, "He who saves the country violates no law." And I think that he has set out to pursue his policies without regard to the Constitution, and certainly without regard to any notion of checks and balances.
There are some strange steps in this dominance, if you like, agenda. One of the early steps was to, in essence, take over the Kennedy Center, which I had a hard time understanding why that was an early action. Do you have any theory about his movement towards a variety of arts institutions and others that would seem to be less important if one was really trying to move towards a dictatorship?
I think it's about power and control. This was an easy one for him to exercise power and control. Why did he want to rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, or Denali Mountain back to Mount McKinley? Mm-hmm. Or why is he changing monuments and military bases back to Confederate generals? Or why does he now want the Washington Commanders football team and the Cleveland Guardians baseball team to go back to other names? I think it's just about his trying to show how much influence, how much power, how much control he has.
Sometimes I think he's got a set of files in his desk, one more request or outlandish demand whenever somebody gets close to something he doesn't want to talk about, be it the Epstein files or whatever else.
I don't know if everybody has seen what occurred this week, and I do believe it's an attempt to deflect attention from the Epstein files. On Sunday, President Trump reposted a fake video on Truth Social that shows President Barack Obama being pushed down to his knees and then arrested. And then, in the last couple of days, President Trump said that Barack Obama committed treason. Tulsi Gabbard, the director of intelligence, said Barack Obama committed treason. Accusing somebody of treason is incredibly serious. It's totally groundless here, but I think it is part of President Trump's playbook about deflecting attention here from all the Jeffrey Epstein things. And, there hasn't been that much of an outcry about it because I think people have somewhat been desensitized and inured to President Trump doing outrageous things.
Mm-hmm. There are also questions about how much of this is coming from President Trump's strategy in mind and how much is coming from the people around him or his collection of individuals. Now, clearly, some of the individuals that he appointed in the cabinet were there to carry out ideas, but there may be others who are a part of the source of this strategy. How do you see that?
Sure. And I think there's undoubtedly a synergy between President Trump and those around him. I mean, Stephen Miller clearly has an agenda with regard to immigration, with regard to diversity programs, and I think that he's in sync with President Trump, and President Trump can articulate that. I'm not sure who came up with the idea of targeting law firms. I don't know who came up with the idea of targeting universities. Was it Trump on his own, or was it Christopher Rufo with regard to universities? Christopher Rufo, who's been advising President Trump, said that the goal is to cause universities, I'm quoting here, to feel existential terror. He said that the goal is to put elite universities in deep recession. So how much came from President Trump? How much came from Christopher Rufo? I don't know, but the key is, of course, what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Others have expressed concern over the president's strategies which have brought him personal wealth, whether it's the cyber securities or whether it's his lawsuits against the media companies that have resulted in personal payments to him. How important do you think that is in this first 6 months or in his strategy?
The Constitution has two provisions that limit the ability of a president to be able to profit from being in office. One is found in Article 1, Section 9, and it's often called the Emoluments Clause. And it applies to anybody who works for the federal government, any federal officer, and it says that they can't receive any emolument, any benefit from a foreign government. The framers of the Constitution were very worried that foreign governments might exercise undue influence over the new nation. And so they put this clause into the Constitution. When you see President Trump being given a plane that's worth almost $1 billion, and apparently it's ultimately for his personal possession, you couldn't have a clearer violation of the Emoluments Clause. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution has a provision that says the president cannot receive any emolument, any financial benefit for being in the office other than the salary that's paid to him. The goal of this was to keep presidents from personally profiting from being president of the United States. When you look at the Bitcoin that's been issued and other things, the tremendous enrichment of the president. So these actions are unconstitutional. I just think it's a question of would anyone have standing to sue and be able to successfully stop this in federal court. I worry, though, about what this means in terms of the public confidence in the government. I started by saying part of why I think there's a crisis of democracy is the loss of confidence in the government. If the people perceive the government is corrupt, what will it then mean for further undermining the legitimacy of the government? And what will that mean for our democracy in the long term?
There are some other actions like birthright citizenship that apparently are related to his concern about immigration. Tariffs, though, have occupied so much of the airtime over the last 6 months. Is that tied to your concept of a strategy that weakens democracy?
Let me deal with each of the examples you mentioned. First, for birthright citizenship, most people aren't aware that from the time the country began in 1787, it was always the law that anyone born in this country was a United States citizen. And that came to us from England, where there was always birthright citizenship. In 1857, in the tragic decision of Dred Scott versus Sanford, the Supreme Court said that enslaved people are not United States citizens, even if they're born in the United States. In 1868, when the 14th Amendment was adopted, the first sentence says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States, within the jurisdiction thereof, are United States citizens. In 1898, in United States versus Wong Kim Ark, a case that arose in San Francisco, the Supreme Court emphatically said, everyone born in the United States is a United States citizen, regardless of the immigration status of their parents. The court said within the jurisdiction thereof just means if there's an invading army and a soldier as a baby, or there's a foreign diplomat as a baby, they're not a citizen. On many occasions since the Supreme Court has reaffirmed, everyone born in the United States is a United States citizen. President Trump issued an executive order on January 20th to try to greatly restrict that. Essentially, it says only those born to citizens or those with green cards are United States citizens. Every federal court to rule on the executive order has declared it unconstitutional. Just yesterday, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit declared it unconstitutional. Ultimately, it'll go to the Supreme Court. And this is one where I predict President Trump will lose in the Supreme Court. The history, the text of the Constitution, precedents are so clear about this. As to tariffs, I want to talk about it from a legal perspective. I'm not one to be able to evaluate the economics and whether they're good or bad for the country. There's a federal statute that allows the president in an economic emergency to set tariffs. In fact, the phrase economic emergency is in the title of the law. And the question is, does our current situation qualify as an economic emergency where the president has unlimited power to set tariffs? It'll be interesting to see what the courts decide on that. So far, the lower courts have ruled against President Trump on this issue.
Let's talk about his relationships with the two major counter forces that are supposed to exist, Congress and the Supreme Court. With Congress, do you see some of the same principles of intimidation at work as he makes a 1 or 2 vote a majority in the House and a 3-vote majority in the Senate work consistently to his benefit?
I think we would all agree, whether we see ourselves as Democrats or Republicans, that so far Congress has not played any checking function with regard to the president. That when it came to his large budget bill that will dramatically increase the deficit by giving tax breaks to the wealthy and cutting social service like Medicaid and food aid for the disadvantaged, he was able to get it through Congress. Recently, President Trump used the power under the Empowerment Control Act to propose rescission of $9 billion of money, and this included all funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, NPR, and he was able to get Congress to go along. Again, it took J.D. Vance breaking a tie, but so far the Republicans in Congress have been almost entirely in lockstep with him, enough they could pass what he wants. He has threatened Republicans if they don't go along with him, that he'll support challengers in primaries. He's done everything good to induce Republicans who were recalcitrant to go with him. He offered Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska, all sorts of things for her state, so she would vote in favor of the budget bill. Had she voted against it, it would have failed, because it was a tie in the Senate that was broken by J.D. Vance. So he has been masterful in getting Congress to go along, but Congress certainly hasn't been a check. As I said, that really leaves the courts to check, I mentioned earlier, the federal district courts have been terrific. The federal courts of appeals have largely affirmed and ruled against Trump. But so far, the Supreme Court has been terrible in checking Trump. Let me mention a couple of examples that maybe haven't gotten very much media attention. One is something that the Supreme Court did on June 23rd. It's a case that's called Department of Homeland Security versus DVD. It involves the effort by the Trump administration to send individuals from Venezuela and Cuba to South Sudan. These individuals have no contact with South Sudan. They don't speak the language there. Federal law specifies for persons to be deported where they're to be taken. And it gives 5 different places where you can take somebody. Ideally, you'd return them to the country they came from. If they're from a different home country, you can take them there. You can take them where they're born. And only if none of these are possible does the government get to take somebody to yet a different country. President Trump said that these individuals were going to be taken to South Sudan. Why South Sudan? Well, it was a place where it would obviously intimidate and terrorize people to know that they would go there. The federal district court said he was issuing a preliminary injunction because it didn't follow the federal statute, and also that these individuals could face torture and death in South Sudan. On June 23rd, the Supreme Court lifted the preliminary injunction, allowing these individuals to be taken there. It was 6-3. To me, what was most stunning was the 6 justices of the majority didn't write a word of explanation. There was no opinion at all. Justice Sotomayor wrote a scathing dissent. Or another example, and this goes to something you mentioned earlier, the president's claim of the ability to remove members of agencies and even to fire all federal employees. In 1935, in Humphrey's Executive versus the United States, the Supreme Court said that Congress can create federal agencies, and Congress can say that the heads of the agencies can be removed only for good cause. That case involved the Federal Trade Commission, and the law said its commissioners be fired only for good cause, and the statute defined what good cause means. The Supreme Court unanimously upheld that law. Humphrey's Executive has been the law for 90 years. President Trump has said in his executive orders and other proclamations that he's not going to follow Humphrey's Executive. He believes there's a unitary executive where the president is in charge of the executive branch and can fire anybody. Gwen Wilcox is a commissioner on the National Labor Relations Board. Her term goes to 2028. The law says she can be fired only for cause. President Trump fired her. The Federal Court of Appeals said, Humphrey's Executive, that we have to follow that 90-year-old precedent. The Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision, ruled in favor of President Trump and allowed the firing of Gwen Wilcox. Justice Kagan pointed out in dissent that the Supreme Court was overruling a 90-year precedent without explanation on its emergency docket. Then another related case, there was a lawsuit that was brought here in federal court in San Francisco on behalf of a large number of federal employees who were fired from about a dozen federal agencies. The federal district court judge, Susan Ilston, said these firings violated the law. It violated civil service protections. It was done without due process. The Federal Court of Appeals upheld. The Supreme Court, though, reverses and 6-3 allows the firings to go forward. It seems what the Supreme Court is saying is that the president can fire anyone in the executive branch, and even civil service protections that have existed since the 19th century are unconstitutional. If there's any theme in what I'm trying to say tonight to you, to the audience, is what we're seeing now is unprecedented in American history.
The Supreme Court has used, if you like, released Trump to do what he wants to do pending further judicial review. Is that based on some principle that has not been practiced as much before? Because it seems, as you're pointing out, to allow so many things to go forward that are irreversible or do substantial damage.
When a district court issues a preliminary injunction, A court of appeals is to overturn it only if it's found that the district court abused its discretion. That's the technical legal term that a district court preliminary injunction can be overturned only, quote, for abuse of discretion. An abuse of discretion in the law is a very hard standard to meet. It's a standard that's very deferential to the district court. One of the things that troubles me about what the Supreme Court is doing that hasn't gotten much attention is it's not paying any attention to the standard of review. It's not insisting that the district court's preliminary injunction be overturned only if there's an abuse of discretion. Now to go to your direct question, what does it mean? Well, in the context of the case I just talked about, it means that Gwen Wilcox could be fired from the National Labor Relations Board. She can litigate, it'll probably take a couple of years, and even if she wins, well, her term will have expired by that point. Or take the case that I'm involved in on behalf of UC faculty and researchers. Federal district court judge here in San Francisco issued a preliminary injunction against the Trump administration in order the reinstatement of funds. The Trump administration will say, we'll lift the preliminary injunction and let the litigation go on. Imagine that the litigation goes on, there's no preliminary injunction. In 2 or 3 years from now, the researchers win. By that point, their laboratories will have closed, they'll lost their graduate students, they'll lost their postdocs. That's why the preliminary injunction to preserve the status quo is so important.
Do you have any insight about why the Supreme Court seems unconvinced by that kind of an argument?
Virtually all of the rulings have been 6-3, split along ideological lines. Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett in the majority, Justice Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson dissenting. And my guess is that in our society, there's a real split between how those who self-identify as Republicans and those who self-identify as Democrats see what's going on. During the first Trump presidency, Trump's approval rating among Republicans was 87%, and his approval rating among self-identified Democrats was 7%. My guess is the gap is as large now or even larger. And so the only thing that I can say is it looks like the 6 conservative justice appointed Republicans see it in the way that Republicans in society see it and are supporting President Trump. And the 3 justices appointed by Democrats see it the way those who are Democrats see it. The justices are human beings who live in society. I don't know that we have any likelihood that they'll see it differently than those of the same political party.
And do you suspect that that is that they see the need for stronger executive power, or is there something else going on?
I think that they see a need for stronger executive power. I think they buy the unitary executive theory that the president's in charge of the executive branch and can fire anybody. I think they side with the president in terms of the need for strong executive power as to foreign policy. They've been inconsistent in the fund cutoff cases that have come to them, but the more recent cases have allowed the president to cut off funds. There was a ruling a week ago Monday, the cases McMahon versus New York. This was a lawsuit brought challenging President Trump's elimination of the Department of Education and his firing of thousands of people to effectuate that. As I said earlier, Congress created the Department of Education. The president can't unilaterally eliminate a department. The people who work there are civil service employees. They're protected. But the Supreme Court, 6-3, allowed President Trump to fire the 1,000 individuals and effectively eliminate the Department of Education. And again, to me, what's especially troubling is the Supreme Court did this without a word of explanation or opinion.
Let's talk about some of the other possible guardrails. We've talked a lot during the beginning of this administration about the evaporation of guardrails, but we talked about Congress, and so far they have not exerted control. We've talked about the Supreme Court. What confidence do you have in any of Trump's appointees and cabinet officials that they might resist some of the stronger measures? Next
question. The reaction you're hearing from the audience. In Trump's first term, we now know that people in the cabinet at times said no to him. I think he was very careful this time to pick individuals who aren't likely to say no to him. Mm-hmm. And so I worry greatly that you're not going to have that possible check on the president.
Mm-hmm. What about military officers? I suspect Pete Hegseth fulfills your definition that you just gave, but what about military officers themselves?
I don't know. If you've listened to General Wesley Clark when he's been on CNN and the news, he makes the point very powerfully that those within the military have the oath to uphold the Constitution, that they're not to follow unconstitutional orders. But of course, those in the military are also trained that they're supposed to follow orders. What will happen when there are unconstitutional orders? Will the military be able to resist them, or will the military just be a tool? And how might they be used? I don't think we know at this point.
What about individual members of the Republican Party? We've seen a few in the Senate. Mitch McConnell has voted against the president a couple of times, and the other so-called swing voters have. Tom Tillis stepping out after criticizing Trump. Is there hope in your mind for Republican opposition emerging over the next 3.5 years?
I hope so, because I so believe that checks and balances are essential, and Congress has a crucial checking function. They haven't done so yet, even with the very close margins in the House and the Senate. But I hope that they will fulfill their constitutional responsibility.
Mm-hmm. What about the Democrats? Are they doing the right things to address the crisis that you're describing?
No, I don't think so. I think the Democrats were shell-shocked by how much President Trump did and how quickly he did it. And I think what we're missing now is effective spokespeople for the opposition. I don't think that Chuck Schumer or Hakeem Jeffries have played that role effectively. There are times that Cory Booker has done so. I think his astounding filibuster was a way of trying to attract attention. There was an instance about a week ago where President Trump nominated Emil Bove to be a federal court of appeals judge, and the Democrats all got up and walked out of the hearing. Bove is the person who apparently said within the Justice Department that if a court ordered that the president stop sending people to El Salvador, the president should just disobey that court order. It was Bove who was one of President Trump's lawyers when he was prosecuted in New York. And it was in that instance that when the Democrats walked out that Cory Booker was there to really articulate an opposition vision. But I think the Democrats need to have leaders emerge who can articulate an alternative vision, and it hasn't happened effectively yet.
What about state and local office holders, say a California governor, for example? What kind of role might they play?
Gavin Newsom has sometimes stood up to President Trump and sometimes seems to not have stood up to President Trump. And we can all come up with the examples. I mean, I thought it was important that he filed the lawsuit against President Trump when President Trump federalized the California Guard. Attorney General Rob Bonta has been very aggressive in filing lawsuits on behalf of California to unconstitutional and illegal Trump administration policies. A number of the attorney generals in blue states have done so as well.
Mm-hmm. What about other levels of government? Is there anything, cities or school boards or library boards or others? What is the proper response, or is there an effective response at that level?
Well, I want to put this in the context of immigration, and it's important to recognize that states and cities do not have to cooperate with ICE. They can't obstruct ICE. So, for example, when a city like San Francisco says it's a sanctuary, that doesn't literally mean that it's a sanctuary. A city can't protect people from ICE or federal authorities. But it means that the city isn't going to cooperate with ICE. Why is that important? Well, Los Angeles police for decades have had the policy that they're not going to cooperate with ICE because if people fear they're going to be deported, they're not going to report crimes. They're not going to come forward as witnesses. They're not going to come forward when they're victims of crime. And so their position is, we're just not turning people over to ICE. It makes sense that schools won't cooperate with ICE, because if they did, then parents aren't going to send their children to school. It makes sense that public hospitals won't cooperate with ICE, because then people who are sick, including with communicable diseases, won't come for treatment. And the Supreme Court has held that the federal government can't commandeer state and local governments, which means they can't force state and local governments to cooperate and administer federal programs. There was a case in the Supreme Court in 1997, Prince versus United States, that involved the Brady Handgun Control Act, and it required that state and local law enforcement personnel do background checks before issuing permits for firearms. And the Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional, saying that Congress can't commandeer state and local governments and force them to administer a federal mandate. So, cities and all of the institutions that you mentioned that I talk about, their police, their schools, their health, don't have to cooperate with ICE, but they can't obstruct ICE when it's going about its duties either. That's what it means to be a sanctuary city. It's not going to cooperate with federal immigration authorities, and cities have the right to do that.
And you are fairly critical of social media in your book about its contribution to this crisis. Do you see any hope of social media playing a role in addressing the crisis at this point?
Social media is a tool. It can be used to spread hatred and vitriol, but it can also be used to inform and enlighten. And I hope that one of the things we can talk about a little bit is, what can all of us do going forward? And I think social media is a way that we can put forward an alternative message and rally people for a very different vision of government that we're seeing right now from the Trump administration.
Let me just ask you about your new project.
Yeah.
We Hold These Truths. You are using the internet and social media to, as I understand it, teach constitutional principles. Tell us about that and how it responds to the moment.
I was talking to a friend, Lisa Tucker, who's a professor at Drexel Law School in Philadelphia, at the end of April. And we were talking about what might we do to educate people about the law and democratic principles. Our country does a terrible job of civic education. And we came up with an idea of trying to get a bipartisan group of people to see if we could draft a set of basic principles of constitutional democracy. Our goal was to publish it as an ad in the New York Times on July 4th, hence the title, We Hold These Truths, and went out to try to recruit 20 people. I asked Michael Ludig, a former federal court of appeals judge, who's quite conservative, to be our co-chair. I then reached out to prominent individuals who you would know. I went to liberals. I got Stacey Abrams, Pete Buttigieg, Jamie Raskin to be part of the group of 20. But I also went to Republican governors, Christine Todd Whitman, Brian Sandoval, the former Republican governor of Nevada. I decided that I would go and ask a former federal court of appeals judge who was known as being conservative, Thomas Griffith, and a former court of appeals judge who's known to be liberal, David Tatel, to be part of the project. I got the popular author Brad Meltzer to join us in this. Got Wesley Clark to be part of this. Sherilyn Ifill, former Solicitor General Seth Waxman, a number of prominent law professors. We divided into 5 groups, one focusing on the rule of law, one on democracy and elections, one on separation of powers, one on personal freedom, and one on equality. And we asked each group to see if they could draft 4 or 5 basic principles. And they did. They shared them with the larger group. We did a lot of group editing, and we succeeded. We came up with a set of principles that all 20 of us could unanimously agree to. The goal was to be no more than could fit on one page of the New York Times as an ad. And we wanted it to be sufficiently specific. It wasn't platitudes. And on July 4th, page A7 of the paper edition of the New York Times was our one-page ad. It was page 3 of the San Francisco Chronicle that day and in many other newspapers. We have a website. I think the website is weholdtruths.com. We've asked people simply to sign on to what we've done, and tens of thousands of people have signed on. And now a group in Washington, Democracy Forward, is going to use this as a basis for a public education campaign. There's going to be a children's book written about it. There's going to be videos based on it. There's going to be a social media campaign, all of which is just a small way of trying to educate people and also to say that even this very ideologically diverse group can identify values that we share in common. And these are more important than what divide us.
Great.
Thank you.
Let me start with a couple of the questions that we have. Knowing all that you do and feeling that there is a lot going wrong, is there anything that gives you optimism, hope, moments in which you see light in our current situation?
One is history gives me hope. American democracy has faced challenge before, and it's proven resilient. I'm hopeful that the guardrails of democracy will hold and that we will still be a constitutional democracy in 2029 and beyond. And if I look at the whole sweep of American history, overall, there's been great advances with regard to equality and freedom. I mean, think of how race was treated when the Constitution was written in 1787. I was born in 1953. There was still at that time Jim Crow laws that segregated all the southern states and a lot of aspects of northern states. There's certainly an enormous ways to go with regard to racial equality, but there's been tremendous progress. I could say the same thing with regard to gender equality. It was only 10 years ago with regard to sexual orientation that the Supreme Court finally recognized the right to marriage equality for gays and lesbians. We could do the same thing with regard to aspects of freedom and how they've advanced. So I think Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. got it right when he said, the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. And so that gives me hope. The other thing that gives me hope, I've got to tell you, is my students. I'm incredibly fortunate that I get to teach several days a week. And my students bring to law school, my undergraduates bring to college, tremendous idealism. I wouldn't say that they're optimistic right now, but they're idealistic, and they really want to fight for justice and to make society better. So that gives me hope.
One of the questions has to do with the civic education, and do you see that as making a significant difference? You mentioned it was one small effort, but clearly, if the country was educated more on civic affairs and constitutional provisions.
I'm constantly struck by the lack of awareness and understanding about government. I'll give some examples. Earlier this year, the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security said that habeas corpus gives the president the power to deport people without due process. This is the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security who was previously the governor of a state. Of course, habeas corpus means that somebody who's being held can argue that they're being detained unconstitutionally or illegally and go to court for relief. It has nothing to do with the president's power in that regard. The senator from Alabama, Tommy Tuberville, couldn't name the 3 branches of the federal government. More people in our society can name some of the 7 dwarfs than can name Supreme Court justices. And I think that there is a responsibility. I spoke at a conference of lawyers and judges this morning in Monterey, and I said, I think it's a real responsibility of all of the lawyers and judges to be going into middle schools and high schools and Rotary clubs and being part of civic education to educate people about these basic principles of constitutional democracy.
A specific question, is there any way for Trump's targets to recover their livelihoods or their attorney's fees or whatever after this episode in American history?
The simple answer is no. The United States Supreme Court held in 1982 in Nixon versus Fitzgerald that a president cannot be sued for money damages for any official acts taken as president. Last year, on July 1st, 2024, in Trump versus United States, the Supreme Court extended to say that a president can't be criminally prosecuted for official acts taken in office. And so the simple answer to the question is no. It would be very difficult for those who lost their jobs to, even unconstitutionally, to sue President Trump.
There are 2 questions about the origins of this anti-democratic moment. One being race. Is racial animosity or reactionary views on race behind this? The other is about rural rage and rural attitudes towards the cities. Is that behind some of this acceptance, if you like, of authoritarianism?
I'm a law professor, not a sociologist, and I'm always cautious about going outside of my area of expertise. So let me try to tie it back to that. And what I argue in the book, No Democracy Lasts Forever, is that one of the tragic flaws of the Constitution in 1787 was with regard to race. And the choices of the framers to protect the institution of slavery have continued to haunt us throughout American history. And so I think whenever we talk about issues with regard to what divides our country, race is certainly a part of the story. I think we can talk about how race is a part of this story, whether the election of Donald Trump was the pendulum swinging after Barack Obama. We can talk about the things that Donald Trump has done with regard to trying to minimize the existence of race discrimination. I mean, just take the example, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Isn't diversity a good thing? We all learn more from being with people who aren't like us. Who's against equity? Why would anyone be against inclusion? Certainly some things have been done taking that or anything too far, and yet diversity, equity, and inclusion has been vilified. And so I think there's a real story there with regard to the role of race here, and it all ties back to choices made long ago in American history. As to rural rage, there's a tremendous gap right now between those who are urban and college educated and those who are not college educated and those who are in rural areas. I think that President Trump has found a way to speak to those who are disaffected, and the Democratic Party hasn't done so.
Let's spend the last couple of minutes here focused on where we go from here. There are several questions about that. What do you expect from the next 3.5 years? Are these battles over individual initiatives, court cases, Supreme Court decisions, and so on? Is that the nature of the next 3.5 years?
I'm stunned by how much has gone on in the first 6 months of the Trump presidency. I assume that he will continue to take actions like this. He will continue to take actions without regard to the Constitution, and therefore his actions are going to get challenged in court and be litigated. As of last week, and I don't know the number now, over 330 lawsuits have been filed against Trump executive orders and administrative actions in federal court. I think that we will see this continue, and we're really dealing with such fundamental transformations in the nature of government in the United States. Is there going to be a mobilization of sentiment against the president? Are people going to effectively speak out and rally? Might there be a point where he loses enough Republican support in Congress that they're not just a rubber stamp? What happens in the November 2026 elections? Will the Democrats take the House or maybe even the Senate? So all of these we just can't know at this moment in time, but they'll certainly shape what we see in the next 3.5 years.
Someone has already read your book and has asked, are you still of the belief that a constitutional convention may be necessary to address the issues, the weaknesses and the flaws of American democracy?
At some point, though I don't think this is the moment, again, no constitution lasts forever. This Constitution isn't going to last forever. This Constitution is flawed in some basic ways that contribute to the crisis of democracy. The Electoral College is a terrible way of choosing a president. 2 senators per state makes no sense. Wyoming has, the difference between California and Wyoming in population is 68 times. In the first 2 years of the Biden presidency, when there were 50 Republican senators and 50 Democratic senators, the 50 Democratic senators represented 42 million more people than the 50 Republican senators. Life tenure for Supreme Court justices makes no sense. We can go on. The more the Supreme Court says that the Constitution today is limited to what it meant in 1787, the more absurd it is to be governed by it. So, I think we should begin thinking about and talking about how will we go about a new Constitution. I don't think this is the moment in which it's realistic to do it.
And you also recommended a variety of measures such as term limits for judges and other matters which could be addressed without a constitutional amendment. Is that time for that likely to come sooner than time for a constitutional convention?
I actually think a constitutional amendment for term limits for Supreme Court justices is possible right now, so long as it's made prospective after these justices leave their positions. If it applied to these justices, there's no way the Republicans in Congress of the states would approve it. In 2016, 3 Republican candidates for president, Rick Perry, Ben Carson, and Mike Huckabee, endorsed 18-year non-renewable terms for Supreme Court justices. I've seen a Gallup poll that 77% of the American people favor term limits for Supreme Court justices. So I think that's a change that's possible, but we wouldn't see the effect of it for a long time to come.
Thank you. Given this topic and the continuing developments on Trump's strategy and the next 3.5 years, there will undoubtedly be the need to have you come back and assess the next 6 months and the next 6 months and the next 6 months from here forward. But I would like to thank our guest, Dean Erwin Chemerinsky, who has been with us today to talk about the first 6 months of the Trump administration and his views on the Constitution and his views on the health of democracy. For more information about membership and upcoming in-person and virtual Commonwealth Club programs, please visit commonwealthclub.org. And thank you for being our audience this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for being a wonderful moderator.